On the first day of my retreat at the Pecos Benedictine Monastery in northern New Mexico, I was sitting on a very large boulder looking over the Pecos River. And as I sat there, I noticed in the distance of probably about 2 to 3 miles, a thin tendril of smoke begin to rise above the pines. And in just a few moments, that very thin thread had become a large column of brown smoke. I climbed down from the boulder, raced back to the monastery to advise them of the fire that was brewing. And for the next 3 days, my retreat turned into helping feed and house the hundreds of firefighters and hotshot crews that were there to control the Dalton Canyon fire. Now, fortunately, they were able to control it with only 800 acres being destroyed, no loss of human life. It was devastating nonetheless. And at the end of my retreat week, I drove back into the canyon to look at the damage. And quite frankly, I was stunned. For the lush pine forest of which I was accustomed had been severely damaged. There were burnt and empty trunks of trees, more than half of the trees destroyed, and the entire landscape was covered in ash. The devastation of a wildfire is destructive. Yet at the same time, a wildfire can bring new life. Less than a year later, I was back at the monastery, and I like to hike those mountains. And as I walked through the burn scar, I noticed that some of those trees that had survived a fire were already growing new branches and new leaves. And as I walked along the ground, I had to be careful not to step on the little seedlings that had begun to sprout from the earth. For arborists will tell you that wildfires can help restore the life of a forest. In fact, the pine cone needs the heat of the fire in order to melt the resin within to release the seeds for new trees to grow from the soil. So yes, fires can be destructive, but fires can also give new life. In today's gospel reading, Jesus starts by saying that he has come to set the earth on fire and how he wishes it were already ablaze. He comes at a time when the political and religious leaders had hardened their hearts against the word of God. They were like the resin inside the pine cone that could not release God's love into the world. They were dead wood. And Jesus came into the world to burn away the dead wood and to release the love of God, that seed of new life, into the world. But then as he continues, he says, I will cause division. That's what's going to happen. Was he telling us that that's his primary mission? Hey, I've come just to divide the world? No. Jesus was recognizing in that moment the effect of what would happen. For some, their hearts would be set on fire, in tune with the love of God. For others, their hearts would remain closed, and that is what would cause the division, setting father against son and mother against daughter. Mothers-in-laws and daughters-in-law may not need any help. In the world today, we find that there is much fire of destruction. There are wars and threats of wars around the world. We know that there's words of hatred and senseless violence in our nation and in other nations as well. Racism and prejudice at many times abound. And the destruction and disrespect for the sanctity of human life continues unabated in many forms, whether it be in abortion, whether it be in the maltreatment of the poor, of the immigrant, of the foreigner, in euthanasia, or the death penalty. There is plenty of fire of destruction in the world today. But you and I are called to accept the blazing torch that God has sent us to reignite the fire of life in the world, a fire of love and a fire of peace. You know, back in the 70s when I was still growing up in the faith, the Catholic Church kind of got a bad rap. We got called the Kumbaya Church because we always talked about God's love, that God's love could cure everything. They saw us as weak. They say, oh, you Christians, you're just, Christian pacifism or Christian do-gooders. But the reality is, to preach the fire of love into the world is not a sign of weakness. It is a sign of incredible strength and heroism. And it is a strength and heroism that we celebrate in the lives of the saints throughout our church's history. We look at the first martyr, Deacon Stephen, who continued to proclaim the life-giving message of Jesus Christ even while he was being stoned to death. And his final words, just like Jesus, were words of forgiveness for those that killed him. All of the apostles courageously preached the good news of Jesus Christ, even though they were warned by the religious and political authorities not to do so, even though they knew, and for 11 of the 12, it did end in them being killed. But martyrdom and heroism and the call to bring the life message of the fire of God's love to the world is not restricted to the ancient saints. We can look into modern times to St. Maximilian Kolbe, who, despite his own suffering in the prison and death camps of Germany, continued to minister to his fellow prisoners and ultimately offered his life to go to the gas chamber in place of someone else, a stranger that he hardly knew. There was St. Teresa of Calcutta, Mother Teresa as we grew to know her, who went into the slums of India. She bound the wounds, she treated the open sores, she fed the hungry, and she cared for the poorest of the poor in neighborhoods that others would not even go. St. Oscar Romero, who spoke truth to power, taking up the message of the poor against those to which to oppress the poor. And he continued to do so up until the time he was shot and killed while celebrating Mass. And it is not only the great saints of the church who we recognize that are called to bring the fire of God's love and life to the world. Just yesterday, I attended the funeral of a dear friend of mine, a brother Deacon, Deacon Dave Gray, who spent a great part of his ministry and his life bringing that fire of life and love to the world. He got to know the homeless on the streets of Orlando, not just by face, but by name. He talked to our brothers and sisters on the streets, and he learned their stories. He visited any time someone called him to come to a hospital, and he went to the prisons where we lock people away that we don't want to see. Deacon Dave went into those prisons, bringing that same message of life and love to the incarcerated. And he was an advocate for those that are victims of human trafficking in our state, in our country, and around the world. Deacon Dave's life ministry reminded me that this call to set the world ablaze, to bring the fire of God's life and love, is not restricted to a few. It's a call that all of us are to follow by virtue of our baptism, by being Christians. But let me warn you, my friends, Jesus tells us in today's gospel message what will happen. When you and I make the choice to bring the message of life and love of the gospel, it will cause division. If we stand up for the rights of the unborn, there will be those that will shut us off. If we stand up for the rights of the poor and the immigrant and the oppressed, we will be cut off from others. If we stand against the death penalty, still others will turn their back on us. You see, that is the life of a Christian disciple. To speak the words of the fire of life and love of Jesus Christ, despite how we may be persecuted, how we may be divided from those that cannot hear our message. The world has enough fire of destruction. We are called to bring the fire of life. Some hearts will be set ablaze and embrace it, and others will continue to be hardened and reject the truth. But our prayer today should be this: The fire of God's love will melt the resin of our own hearts, so that those seeds of life and love may be sowed into the world and transform it. And that we will accept the firebrand that Jesus hands us, and together we will set the world ablaze.